I redesigned all 6 of the current Valheim boss zones. Hey everyone, my name is Smitty, and today we're taking on a whole new kind of creative challenge. Today I'll be putting on my world building hat and reimagining all 6 of the current Valheim boss zones into epic themed arenas. If you want to play through this map, it will be available for download on the Smitty Survival Patreon page, but a big shout out and thank you to my patrons who support the content. Hope you all enjoy, and without further ado, grab a snack, grab a drink, and let's get right into it. Valheim has some great bosses, but it's time to give their summoning areas the love they deserve. This one is largely going to be a world building project, utilizing Valheim's natural game assets to deliver a new look to the boss fight experience. Starting with Eikthyr, I wanted to establish a theme that was a more ominous take on the meadows. So I started by framing the summoning area with a large swamp tree as my focal point, and then added some blue braziers as I felt like the blue flames really enhanced that arcane feeling of the altar. After some experimenting, I found that barley is actually a scalable asset in Valheim, so I had the idea that if I scaled them up and scattered them throughout the meadow, it'd look like plots of corn. And so growing up, I feel like I'd always see deer roaming through the cornfields in the areas that I lived, so I thought this would be a fitting theme for the Eikthyr setting. From here, it's just a matter of adding various stump, dead trees, and rocks to fill out the theme of this area and set the scene. I tried my best to make everything seem more scattered and random. For instance, you'll see that the fences are crooked and rarely line up, and the carts are flipped over. These are subtle clues to tell the story that this area has been long forgotten, perhaps left behind after the original inhabitants woke powers they should not have. Overall, I was happy with this first redesign. It wasn't anything crazy, but still felt like the meadows, with an ominous twist to it, which was the goal. Next up was the Elder. Set in the Black Forest, I knew that this design had to synergize well with the forest theme. I started by using a scaled up oak tree as my focal point. My thought here is that I would make a tree of souls, meshing the twisted faces of the petrified skulls into its trunk, and adding an arm reaching out to the altar, almost as if daring adventurers to accept the challenge to defeat its champion. Failure would mean that their souls would be absorbed by the tree, becoming just another twisted face added to its collection. For the area surrounding the altar, I wanted to frame it like a forest arena. So I utilized the fallen swamp trees and stood up an archway, and then proceeded to encircle the area with multiple layers to create a bit of a barrier. I really liked how this created what looked like a twisted wall around the altar as the branches wove and layered together. I then decided to add some Grey Dwarf spawners on the inside to provide a little extra challenge for the boss battle. The plan is to have all these areas be playable, so I thought adding elements that added additional gameplay challenges would be fun. I finished up the build just by framing the entrance a little bit better. I really wanted these areas to really stand out, so I added elements that would really draw explorers towards this altar. I was really happy with the final result and liked the lore behind this one. Next on the list was Bonemass, and I was really excited to lead into some of the darker themes for this one. I started by adding more bone elements to the altar itself, meshing some smaller skulls to the back, and then adding large piles of bones surrounding it. I really liked the look of the bone piles, so I would definitely repeat this idea throughout this project. Next, I had a bit of a wild idea to set this entire scene inside of a rib cage. So I scaled up the petrified ribs from the Mistlands large enough to encompass the altar, which actually looked really cool. I then proceeded to add more petrified skulls, green torches, and additional bone piles scattered throughout the zone. Next, I wanted to integrate the hanging chain hooks into the scene. This is normally found at the Diverger settlements in the Mistlands, but I had the idea of incorporating them in a more menacing way. After scattering the hooks on the ceiling, I rotated one of the bone piles vertically and then clipped it into the bottom of the hook to make it look like hanging bodies. A simple idea, but it really ended up being a dark decorative element that I really liked. From there, I would just add some additional skeleton spawners, and the Bonemass zone was complete. I really love how the ribcage makes this whole scene feel like it's set in a giant cave made of bones, which is really cool, and I felt like the different elements really enhanced the overall skeleton theme on this one. Next on the list was Motor. Set high in the mountains, my vision for this boss zone was to create some kind of dragon nest, but use the ice cave assets to really give it a wintry theme. I started out by framing the altar with some stones. These pieces are actually the giant thumb assets that are typically seen in the Yagluth altar, but I found that rotating them sideways made for an interesting stone frame for this one. I then had the idea of using the ice cave stalagmites as my main decorative element. I started by creating some really large copies to give the nest an epic sense of scale, but then proceeded to add some smaller groupings, wildly scattering them around to make it look like these ice pikes really protect the nest. The result actually looked super cool and dramatic, and thematically very strong. Next, I wanted to add some additional decorative elements on the inside. I added some large bone piles to suggest the remains of those whom Motor had consumed over the years, but also added some meat piles to depict partially consumed remains. In a lot of different dragon lore, it's pretty common for dragons to have a keen eye for gold and treasure, so I also decided to incorporate some treasure piles scattered throughout the nest as well. Overall, I really liked this redesign a lot. It felt super dramatic and high fantasy, and the ice theme was something really different, which I really liked. Next was Yagluth, and this one was going to be tough because I actually really appreciate the original design of this altar. The way that the massive fingers rise from the ground is already really cool, so I'd have to think carefully about how I was going to proceed on this one. I wanted to start from scratch, so I began by removing the fingers, and then I had the idea that it would be really cool to design this area like a huge meteor strike zone. I started by laying out some flat rocks in a circle facing away from the altar, and the idea was to layer these stones to look like they were displaced by the impact of the strike. So I tried my best to vary the angles and sizes of these stones to depict this scene. Moving on to the inside, I decided to cultivate the land because I thought the darker color made it look like the ground had been singed from fire. My vision was to have this inner area still smoldering with some smaller meteor particles. So I dug some holes and placed the burning meteor assets to add a burning effect to my crater. This not only enhanced the theme well, but also synergized nicely with the fact that one of Yagluth's attacks is actually a meteor shower, so maybe these are just some of the remnants of his past battles. To finish up, I decided to add some giant bone piles to depict that there have been past challengers, but none who have survived. And then I also added some toppled over monoliths on the outside to suggest that the impact of the strike destroyed even the strongest structures of the plains. Overall, I thought this was a really cool redesign that fit really well with Yagluth's theme, and I really liked how the meteor strike story really pulled through. Next up was the Queen, and I was in a bit of a conundrum on this one because the boss battle for the Queen actually takes place within a dungeon, which to be honest is already an excellently designed zone, so instead of focusing on the interior of the dungeon, I thought instead to focus on the outside. For this redesign, I wanted to do something with a really epic scale. I'd recently played through Elden Ring, and I started thinking about the Erd tree, so I wanted to utilize that as inspiration and spawned in a massive oak tree that really dominated the scene. From there, I would place a bunch of Yggdrasil roots that appear to be originating from the giant tree, but I wanted them to reach down into the water, kind of like how mangrove roots do on the coastlines. Although this technically was not the boss summon itself, just the exterior, I think that this made for a really cool and epic entrance into the dungeon, and I was really happy with how it turned out. With all my boss areas redesigned, I was really happy with the results. I think there was a lot of creativity in each one of these, and they had a nice enhanced look to them. All that was left to do now was to see these areas in action.